to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. These are a few of our favorite things, part 2, Everywhere Else, presented by NatHab Guide Development Director and Expedition Leader Annie Van Dinther and Field Operations Manager Corbin Hawkins. It's a pleasure to have you both with us today. Annie, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate all your effort in setting these things up. I know it takes a lot, so thank you so much for that. And Corbin, I have to say, one of my favorite things is doing a webinar with you. It's so fun getting to work with you and make these stories. Thank you so much for holding down the fort yesterday. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Glad to be here. Typically, we have a central theme around these, so I'm really excited to just kind of talk shop with you.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. And I have to say, you know, I wasn't here yesterday. I really appreciate you and Brad taking charge of things. There are a couple animals that we mentioned in the description that we wanted to make sure we got to even today. So we are going to kind of dive right into our favorite things here. And one of my animals from Churchill is the Arctic hare. And I have to mention it because I feel like they get missed. I feel like we talk about the polar bears and we talk about the wolves and, you know, sort of the big exciting animals, and this sweet little hare often is maybe not mentioned enough. The hare that is my favorite hare from Churchill actually became my favorite the year that I didn't see it. And so, Corbin, I don't know if you can imagine this. You know, we go out on these rovers with our guests, and you know that my mind can get kind of obsessed with animal behavior, right? I know that you can go down this path as well, my friend. So if you open up most field guides about the Arctic hare, you will read that, in fact, they do not burrow. They will make a nest just on bare rock. Can you imagine, like, in the Arctic, on that, think about that Canadian shield, and just having your little harelets right out there on the rock. In fact, one of the definitions of the difference between a hare and a rabbit is that when these guys have young, they're precocial, they're ready to roll. They have hair, their eyes are open, and that's because of those harsh conditions. But I could not get the idea of them burrowing out of my mind. I just became basically obsessed with trying to find burrows because to me, I looked around this kind of ecosystem in Churchill and I thought, they burrow. I get it in the high Arctic where it's like all rock. And I thought, okay, I get it there. There's no place to burrow. But here in Churchill, really? Like no burrowing? We see the fox burrows and I don't know, I just like could not stop thinking about it. And one season, we would go up this place just near First Tower. You take a right, and there's this one area where the willows are, and sure enough, we saw this place. You take a turn, and there was this hole in the snow, a burrow, maybe, a front door, and we saw these prints. And then we went a little further, of course, looking for polar bears, right? And then we saw another door. And I was like, it's gotta be a burrow. And I just became obsessed. I needed to check that place every day for a while. So that was one of my favorite things, is perhaps discovering an Arctic hare burrow in Churchill out at the wildlife management area. And then this guy, I mean, who could not fall in love? I realize it's a weasel by many definitions of the term, but it's also an ermine. And this little ermine, some of you, if you've attended my webinars before, you've heard of Herman the ermine. Back in the day when the White Whale Lodge existed, Corbin, and we could fly across the Churchill River over to what used to be the brothel, when the town moved across the river over to the side where it is now. They left the brothel on the other side, for good or for bad. They left it over there, and it soon became a polar bear viewing lodge. That's where I met my husband. And if you were to use the restroom in the night at the White Whale Lodge, you would be almost guaranteed visited by Herman, or we soon found out, Hermanette the ermine, who even if I didn't have to use the restroom, I would wake up every night at the White Whale Lodge, and I could be found just sitting in the restroom for no other reason than to make sure that I got to hang out with Herman at the Ermine. So that was my other favorite thing from Churchill for sure. But these loves came later in life. Let's talk a little bit about how these favorite things develop. Tell us about this beautiful stocking here that says Corbin on it. I want to know about this.
Yeah, so it's funny. I grew up in Texas and I spent my time outside. We had a creek in the backyard, and we were Southern boys. Me and my younger brother, we're picking up crawdads, we're playing with frogs, and I've just always had that sense of nature in me. But to kind of relate it to what I do now, and maybe this picture here is just maybe this is just manifesting something to come in my life. But I was given this polar bear stocking hanger, and I think the late 90s, if not before that. And while at the time it didn't mean anything, it's a Christmas themed stocking holder. Yeah, it manifested something to come, and I've just kind of always had this attachment to polar bears and into nature in general.
I think that's so cool. When as a mom, I think often about where I bring my kids on vacation, because I think there's a seed that gets planted. Do you remember going on places, when you were a kid, and like later you get really attracted to those places? I think
Sure.
as an adult, and I do think about that too, like what gifts you give them, it's definitely planting a seed for what they maybe are going to fall in love with. For me, it was dolphins. This is my daughter. I don't have a picture of me at the Shedd Aquarium as a child, but this is my daughter at the Shedd Aquarium. And so if we could now, Kendall, play that video. So later in life, I didn't have to go to the Shedd Aquarium to, be able to see dolphins.
All right, I am bringing up the video player now. One moment.
So this is a video that I made in Baja, and I had an opportunity to go spend a day in the Loretto Bay with Teresa, one of our guides, and we were preparing for our blue whale extension, which is definitely one of my favorite things. And so we had this incredible thing happen, and for sure going to the aquarium to see those dolphins planted a seed in me as well. So let's check out this video and see what happened in Loretto Bay.
Okay, great. And for those joining us on a mobile device, you may need to swipe to see the video player. And sometimes if you're on a desktop, the video player opens in a separate window, so it might be hidden, so you may have to look for it. Here we go.
So we are in the Sea of Cortez, and we have Pacific white-sided dolphins all around us. There's hundreds of them. We've been with the pod for a few minutes now. We've got the hydrophone in the water, and you can hear their clicks and trills. There's also a few sea lions in the mix. And we are on the Gray Whales of Baja adventure.
All right, Annie, I'm going to give you control back.
Thank you, Kendall. So those are definitely a few of my favorite things, dolphins there. We just had this moment where we were looking for blue whales, but on our way to get to the blue whales, we had thousands of dolphins around us, and we had the hydrophone with us. And I think it's that ability to be able to see them, but also hear them. I mean, researching an animal that you see them for such a short part of their life, right? The majority of their time is underwater. So suddenly to be involved in their complex language and realize that there's this entire communication system going on below us, it was definitely one of my favorite days, that's for sure, in sort of all of my guiding history. So that was a good one. And what for you is that kind of favorite day experience?
Yeah, sure, Annie. I think well, we'll come to find out later that I know nothing about whales, but we'll get to that. More of my experience come from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That's where I've spent majority of my time guiding, and in fact, I called Jackson Hole home for a long time. So What we're looking at here, this is an image of bear 610. And while that might not mean much to you right now, I think I would be remiss without talking a little bit about 610 before I get to the point here. And this is the offspring of a more famous bear. Let's call 610 a star on the rise, but her mother, of course, is bear 399. And for those of you listening, maybe you have seen her, maybe you've heard of her, but if you were to give a quick Google search of the most famous bear in the world, this is who's going to pop up. And what's incredible about 399 is that she's 24 years old, which is, on the upper end of the age limit there. And even more so incredible is that she continues to have litters. She continues to have cubs, and not just in any small fashion. 3 out of her 7 litters have been triplets. And just this year, she emerged from her den with 4. And she's just spectacular, not just to me, but the surrounding community. You'll hear names like $1 billion bear, most famous bear in the world, like I said, but this is a bear that people genuinely care about, a bear that I genuinely care about, and you can tell that the community of Jackson Hole, as you can see by this article here, really genuinely cares about not only the bear, but of course the tourism that it brings to the area. My personal favorite story, however, does involve 399, and you're looking at a picture here on the shore of Jackson Lake. And unfortunately, I was out on a kayak with some friends, and I brought my wide angle lens because I didn't figure we were going to be shooting wildlife, especially not of this caliber. If I'd brought my wildlife lens, me and Tom Mangelson would be hanging out on a beach somewhere right now. But this is bear 399 and her 2 yearlings. And we just came around into this little kind of secret cove that we knew about. And sure enough, there she was. So we pulled our paddles out of the water, and we just kind of floated in her vicinity. We were maybe 50 yards away, but for a good hour, we were able to just sit there and enjoy the peace, the calm, and watch the cubs play. The mom was bathing them. I mean, it was just the most spectacular wildlife experience that we happened upon. And it was so cool to have a private moment with the bear that not only the whole world wants to go see, but our fellow guides alike. And I can show you that by these next photos here. These are follow-up images, not from myself, but these are from our co-guides and expedition leaders, Mike and Drew. This is 399 with her 2 cubs. These are the same cubs that you saw in the previous photo. And it just goes to show that we have this little community, that's not just my favorite, it's not just Drew's favorite or your favorite. We all want to go see these things, and we especially like to see these really kind of interesting behaviors that we're seeing in these photos here with 399. So, and if you'll click,
so cool. I mean, even this morning, right, getting ready for this, we were like, oh, we're preparing, and we thought it'd be great if we could have just 1 or 2 more images of 399. And sure enough, we texted Mike, hey, do you have a little bit more that we could use for 399 to get ready for this webinar? And there we go. He sends over an image. I mean, I think that's one of my favorite things is our team that we have, always trying to improve this experience for our guests to be able to get to know wildlife in this intimate way. It's just such a passion that we all have, and we end up working almost seamlessly because it's what we love to do.
Yeah, the responses is, on their end, it's a no-brainer for them. They say, you guys are talking about your favorite things. Well, funny enough, we've got the same favorite things here. Let's share all of this.
So cool. I love this shot.
So this was taken about, probably about 6 months on the nose after my shot of the blurry shoreline shot that we saw just a minute ago. But yeah, that's my favorite thing about the Tetons. It's got to be.
It's got to be, but there's other things too, right? I mean, look at this one.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to love about the area. Here we've got a pelican on Oxbow Bend, and these are just things that you happen across. Here we've got an elk in Hayden Valley, and I believe the next is another elk. There's just so many cool scenes and so many things to realize upon you, and it makes me think a little bit that maybe it's not the animals in specific, maybe it's not an individual, Maybe it's the behavior that they show that really is my favorite.
You know, it strikes me that for you in these images, there is a common thing that I see with your work, Corbin, and it is the light. It's like there's a dance happening between what you're noticing with the animals and, like you just said, the behavior, and what's happening with the light. And I think there's a bit of a purist perhaps in you. You know, when we think about the definition of photography, the writer in me loves these definitions, right? And we think about the definition of photography is to paint with light, literally. And I think
Sure.
that I almost love this idea. I know I love this idea of you painting animal behavior with light. I think that's sort of like what we've come to here. It's so cool. I mean, look at this. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so something that we're kind of skipping over here, Annie, and we did have a chat about this beforehand, is wolves, and people want to see wolves when we talk about Yellowstone, but we've purposely left them out of this presentation because, in my opinion, we can't talk about wolves and we can't go wolf watching without bison. And to the photographer's standpoint, there's no better way to play with that light, like you speak of, than the bison in Yellowstone. So their behavior and the light playing off of it is really how I guide. And for those of you who watched yesterday, we had Brad on board, and Brad loves to take videos and pictures of the things that surround him, and not just from a photographic standpoint, but there is a video out there similar to the one that Annie just showed of me explaining to a group last summer what we were going to be expecting from the bison. Now, there was wolves in the scope off to the side, but we weren't necessarily focused on them because I wanted to pay attention to what the bison were going to do next. And I think that's the best way to watch wolves, is to try to interpret what they're going to do with their surroundings, not just have them in the scope. And essentially what happened was exactly as I predicted, was that as the wolves approached the bison, who were calmly laying there and moseying about the road and just the roadside, they started to huddle around their young, and they protect themselves from the incoming wolves. And there's just, there's no better way to experience, I think, my favorite animal here in Yellowstone than to watch their behavior in that prey predator sort of relationship.
I think that's so interesting because, when I'm spending time watching animals, I feel that a lot of times I think I'm doing the same thing. I'm watching a few steps ahead. It's not only the main animal, I guess you would say. It's like what's happening in that ecosystem that is leading me to understand what's going to happen next. I mean, in lots of ways, this behavior that we're talking about, it kind of splits me in a way, because partly I'm thinking like, dude, this is like hunter behavior that you're talking about. Like, you've got this awareness that you need to have way back in some part of your brain that knows how to be very aware of your surroundings, right? But it's also, I guess, which is also an ancient behavior, it's also storytelling. It's
Sure.
putting the steps together to tell the story that we do with our guests so they can start to understand the ecosystem and the animals around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't tell the story of a wolf without the story of the food chain beneath it, right? And by looking at a bigger picture like that, that's when you come to find these unique stories, these unique images, and what you're about to show us here is altogether the epitome of what we're talking about.
So that's true. So this bear, it's interesting when we started to gather this up. I don't know if folks know this about the webinars, but we have to write the description of the webinar before we create the webinar. Essentially, it's just kind of how it works. It's almost like proposing a book and then writing the book. So we sort of propose this, and it has to go out to all of you so you can come and join us. And then we put the slides together. It's just how it works. So it's kind of an interesting mirroring process that works, right? Because we create the idea, and then the writer, Wendy, who does such a beautiful job, writes up what we've said the idea is, but then we often go back and look at the idea and go, okay, now let's kind of work from there. And so the idea was, let's talk about our favorite animals. But in the process of the creation of that, we realized that it's not necessarily a specific animal that we become attached to so much as the way that animal behaves. And so while there's famous bears out there like 399, there's also animals that I've grown attached to that it really is because of the way I watched them behave one day. And that's the case with this bear here. This bear is a female. Obviously, she's got her cubs with her. And if any of you have been to Brooks Falls on the Katmai coast in Katmai National Park, that's where this happened. I have to kind of set the scene for this. So at Brooks Falls, everybody has seen that iconic shot of the dominant bear at the falls, you know, trying to catch the fish, right? That bear is almost always the dominant bear. That's sort of the dominant bear spot at the falls. And around the falls is sort of all the other dominant bears, if you will. And it's typically the males that are up around that area. And then in this river system, as you move away from the falls, the lower you get from that area, there's sort of I would almost say a nursery area. There's an area where quite far away from the falls, you tend to get the moms and the cubs, and they're fishing, and there's great fish there. It's not like they're getting the like leftovers, but it just is kind of divided because, as we know, you know, males can go after cubs. It doesn't usually happen when there's tons of fish around, but it can definitely happen. And so that's kind of the lay of the land, if you will, especially as far as dominance. Well, this particular female decided that she wanted to stake a claim to an area of the river that was really close to the falls, an area where moms and cubs just don't go. And she was determined. She put her cubs in this tree, and then she would run out to this one little fishing hole and just protect it. Meanwhile, not getting fish because she was spending all of her energy protecting the cubs in the tree and sort of guarding this one little fishing hole. And literally for the 3 days that I was there with our group, I mean, we were tied to this saga because you just think, Mama Bear, like, go down to the nursery with the other moms and cubs. There's plenty of fish. You don't have to be in so much danger. And these adorable little cubs don't have to be like so frightened. But she stuck it out, and she was determined that this was going to be her fishing spot, and she was going to prove her dominance. And I tell you what, it worked. After about 48 hours, maybe a little more than that, the males in the area got the message. They stopped coming at her. It wasn't worth their time to continue to sort of come at her, and she could just fish. And all of a sudden, the situation turned, and her cubs had more fish than they could even eat. They were lying around lazily and just gorging on the best salmon in the world. They went from this look on their face to this look. They were fed and happy and playing, and she was definitely a new dominant female to be reckoned with in the area. So it was pretty fascinating to see how it all happened. And it made it very clear to me that it was the behavior, not just the bear, that I was in love with in that moment. So, but this shot, what we see here is there's no animals. Tell me about this.
Yeah, Annie, I think I appreciate you bringing up the notion of painting with light earlier, because for me, especially being a photographer and on these trips, we're not just looking at animals. Sure, that's a big part of it, and the behavior is, I think we can both agree on, our favorite part about wildlife watching. But in the context, the larger context of what one of these trips looks like, we're passing some really beautiful places, and again, being that photographer, I am always looking for that light, and I'm looking for those moments of beauty. So this is literally just at the base of the hill in Big Sky, and it's just a roadside stop. I think the next picture coming up here is the Tetons. If you've ever been to the Tetons, they sell themselves. It's almost like almost like you don't even need to market them. Once you're there, you're hooked. And it has nothing to do with the animals. It's just the beauty of the surrounding area. Let's see, what's next here, Annie? Oh, the falls at Yellowstone. Again, it's that light, it's that landscape. It's just the places that exist around the bulk of our trips being the wildlife, but the places that exist around them, there's just so much opportunity, and it's hard to narrow down what a favorite for me would be outside of those animals. But I think it is the thermal features. For me, if you guys watched Annie and I speak on the heart of Yellowstone a couple months back, we kind of came down to the idea that water was the heart of Yellowstone. And now that we're sitting here talking about our favorites, I think that truth remains, in that the hot springs and the geysers, excuse me, and then it's just the available light and all the cool things surrounding the hot springs and geysers, including the people on the boardwalks. There's just so much there. There's so much there.
I love this shot. I think this one is so beautiful. It's so subtle, because at first you're like, wait, am I just looking at a gray, photo here? But then there are people, and I love what this kind of shows about us being smaller than the landscape. I think it's a really beautiful image. And then this one, I think it must be one of my most favorite images of all of your images. I think I say that about everyone that we end up looking at, because I kind of fall in love with each one of them for a different reason. But this, to me, is definitely back to that painting with light idea. And I just find it fascinating. Tell me what was going on here.
Yeah, so we're on the boardwalk. I believe I'm standing near Grand Prismatic, looking towards Excelsior Geyser Crater, so a big thermal feature area in Yellowstone. And especially early in the mornings when the steam is so thick that any light just blows out in the steam, so you can't really pick apart any background, and it just creates this contrast, an extreme contrast, really, that I just find it's one of my favorite things. Annie, me and you have shared over and over. I remember when we were running trips in Yellowstone and you were asking me, what's it like to run a trip during the COVID time? And I shared some images with you. And I think 90% of them were basically this same shot of people walking on the boardwalks. Just another one of my favorite things. But the purpose of being there, if you'll click next, is the thermal features again. So it's just, I'm out of words. I just, looking through these photos, I do it often. I look through my own photos and images of others in the area. And it is the hot springs, I think, that keep me coming back, and not just the features themselves, as we discussed, but the people around them.
And what I find fascinating is, when you and I were building this, you mentioned hot springs, and my mind automatically went to, because I've spent a very short amount of time in Yellowstone, but not a lot. My mind quickly went to hot springs that a person could get into. Right. But none of these are those. These are all hot springs that are visually fascinating, but not that would be at all safe for a human to experience.
No, we're talking about an extreme. We're talking about an extreme environment here. These are pools in excess of 150, and in some cases upwards of 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So we won't be going for a soak anytime soon, as enticing as it looks. But that brings me kind of to the next point, Annie, is what is the draw to these extreme places? I know that I find myself just loving that contrast of a beautiful landscape, the stars in the sky, but then there's this extremely hot water. There's this something that's unobtainable to us. And I think you kind of feel the same way. You're drawn to places that are so far this way and so far this way, and they meet in the middle.
It's interesting that you say it just that way, because when I look at this image here in particular, it reminds me so much of Baja. In fact, I feel like we could do a whole webinar on just the landscape of Baja and Yellowstone. In fact, I think we should do that, because there's a lot that they have in common that I hadn't thought of literally until I looked more closely at this particular image. For me, the extreme landscape, and we don't have in this particular webinar a lot of images that show that, but there's salt flats in Baja. That's what I'm thinking of when I look at that last image of yours. And there's there's a lot that is quite similar. The extremeness that I fall in love with in Baja, it's desert meets sea. I mean, part of me just loves it because, you know, as an Alaskan, getting to go down there in February, right? Like I just get to sort of dry out a little bit, and I just feel better. So I have to confess that partly it is that. But long before it was that, you know, when I first started to go there, I didn't live in Alaska. There's something about, it's just what you're saying. It's this extreme, I don't think I knew as a child that the desert could meet the sea. I don't think I understood, ecologically speaking, that could happen. I mean, I think I would have argued even as a college student that doesn't make sense, because there's moisture coming off of the water, and it seems like it would make a wet ecosystem. Like we all talk about this, you know, I live in a maritime climate. So what happens to that maritime climate when you're in a desert ecosystem next to a sea? We'll leave that for another webinar, but I think it definitely does something back to that primitive brain. I think it's attractive to some very, I don't know, I'm grasping for words too, because it feels very, it's like watching a fire. It's like, there's something like that, like something really satisfying on a very basic level. And I'm not sure what other words to use than that. But that's what it feels like. So there's
I don't know about you, but I like to live in the mountains. I don't like to live in heavily populated areas, but I love to travel to them. I like that notion of being where I like and being in my comfort zone, but then I like to step into a city to get a new experience. And I think we're saying the same thing here, is that we find satisfaction in seeing these, you know, the dichotomy between these landscapes.
You know, it's so interesting you say that, because if any of you, I think some people out there have met my husband because they were in Churchill, and you know, his nickname is Canoe Joe. He canoed from Minnesota to Churchill and then lived off the land, and people would often presume that he hates cities. He loves cities. He loves bustling, intense cities. We had to go to Boston one time for a variety of reasons, and I mean, he was renting the bikes and zipping around, and you know, he loves it. He doesn't want to live in one, but as far as exploring one, yeah, he loved it. For me, Baja, it's not only the animals and the landscape, but when we go with our guests, we also get to go see some of the missions, and understanding the history of the area is also just so phenomenal to me, that these buildings have been there for so long, and that they're still in use, and that the people are still, you know, going to that mission for church, and it's hundreds of years old. There's not a lot of old stuff in Alaska. So I really do appreciate that about the area as well. But it is the whale watching that is the most special thing about going to Baja. I mean, being with our guests and getting to see their reaction. You know, there is one whale this past season that was literally using our boat as like a bath toy. And it was totally safe. There was nothing dangerous about it, but it had so much fun just taking its nose and like putting it underneath our, you know, very soft rubber boat, and just like blowing bubbles underneath the boat so that it could like move it a little bit, and then it would come and like do it again. And that sort of playful interaction, it's such a joy. I mean, you can see the joy on our guests' faces as well. And it's a gleeful trip because of the way that the whales behave. So this is a gray whale, and getting to see them super close up, we have the opposite problem that you had on your trip. You accidentally put a big lens on, and the whale is like right here, and you're like, oh, shoot. But gray whales are different from a behavioral sense than humpbacks. So
hold on a second. I'm a whale noob. We talked about this. I actually don't know, other than belugas in Churchill, that I've ever seen a whale in the wild. This looks exactly the same as the previous, and it's gray.
Okay, we're gonna have to, first of all, we gotta change this, my friend. So we are going to have to definitely make this change for you in your life. When you come to visit me in Homer, we're gonna go whale watching, and we're gonna make sure that this shifts. So yes, this is a gray whale. One of the ways that we know that both of these whales are baleen whales is because they have two external blowholes. So if you think to like that common dolphin, they would just have one, right? Think about the like classic dolphin, but they do have two. It's just that they're internal. So they kind of sit like this, if you think about it, in a dolphin. But in the baleen whales, they're like this. Baleen means that instead of teeth, they have almost like, seriously think about your broom. They have like a broom hanging down from their upper jaw. And it's different in different baleen whales. Like in bowhead whales, their broom is like 10 feet long and it's like flowy. It's like super soft. Whereas in a gray whale, their bottom feeders, their broom is like a hairbrush. Like it's thick and like really hard. And in a humpback, it's somewhere in between those two, and it's about like this long. Wow. So that's all in their mouth. But what's really cool about humpbacks is that unlike the gray whales are like polar bears, in that when I'm watching them, I don't know the difference between this gray whale and that gray whale. Now we're just now getting technology to be able to do some photo IDing of their saddle patch and like some other really cool stuff that if you want to go back to the gray whale webinars, you can really get into that. But basically, when we're watching them, we don't know if we're watching gray whale 399 or gray whale 277. With humpbacks, they have this super unique print on the back of their tail, and it's so unique that there are whales like that will be called giraffe. Well, guess what? The pattern on the back of giraffe's tail looks like a giraffe. There's a scale from 1 to 5. 5 is all black, 1 is all white, and then there's everything kind of in between, as you can imagine. But there's patterns, like there's a whale named Salt. Well, you kind of presume that Salt is probably going to be close to a 1 on that scale. There's a whale named Midnight, all black on the back of the tail there. And so you can look in when I was doing research, it's a catalog that you're paging through. Now, of course, it's all computerized, but you can look it up and you can be like, whoa, this whale is feeding with her mom and her brother's cousin, and oh my gosh, these whales are all feeding together, and it turns out that they're related, or they're not related, and they just grouped up for a couple hours. So you can understand the behavior in this much more intimate way, which is super cool. There's another thing that happens with humpback whales. It's kind of like the gray whales. I haven't had a humpback whale use a boat as a toy quite that way. Other people, I've heard about that happening, but they do get curious about boats. And I have had humpbacks moms almost like give their calf to the boat, like, hey calf, go hang out with that boat while I do some fishing and feeding. I'll be back in a minute. Because they know the boats. Like if you're whale watching for a while at an area, they know which boats are cool and that they can trust. It's pretty interesting. So this is in Antarctica on our sailing expedition. Definitely one of my favorite things. That is for sure. One of the best trips of my life. And for our guests, just having this super intimate experience of being on this sailboat and having a whale come up to us with all this incredible ice around us, that was an experience of a lifetime. That's for sure. So yeah, I got a thing for humpbacks. It's I don't know if you can tell, but
I can sense the excitement. That's a great thing about working with you, Annie, is I can always sense that excitement, whether you're thousands of miles away from me, sitting in a room talking about whales, or whether we're looking at a polar bear together. But something that I know about you is that you're a fierce mother, and that really defines you, and that's a big part of your life. And I think we can take a moment here as we sort of come to an end of this. We've got a few more minutes here, but if you guys, y'all listening, you may have heard this story before if you've been following Annie along, but just kind of draw some reference, Annie, to what it's like being a mother and how you can see that in some of the animals and some of your favorite stories with that mothership lens on.
Sure. So
Motherhood.
mama bear has become a whole new term, that's for sure. Being a guide and a mom, and it does change how you look at any animals that are surviving. When I see 399 and her cubs, I have a way different thing. When you see moms who are worrying over like which sippy cup to use, and partly you're like, maybe you should just be patting yourself on the back because your kids are alive. Like that's what's happening in the wild, right? Is like when you're having that many cubs, surviving is awesome. That's a great goal. So we have had, there's lots of stories about fierce mama bears, and it turns out that just like humans, there are all kinds of different mama bears. There are protective mama bears. There are lazy mama bears. There are easily distracted by food or mating mama bears. There's just all kinds. And just like with humans or with other animals, they're not all one way. And so some of them are super successful. It sounds like 399 is a great mom. She sounds like she's really attentive. She successfully raises her cubs and takes good care of them and doesn't get too distracted. Sounds like she's great at gathering resources and all of those kinds of things. Well, even with polar bears and with brown bears, for years, photographers have said that adoption happens in the bear world. But because of these things we've been talking about, identifying individuals, there wasn't proof that this had happened. When you're watching polar bears, it is so hard. I don't know if you've had this experience out there on the rover, but guests will often be like, we saw 85 bears today. And
Sure.
yes, in a way you did, because you had 85 different experiences seeing bears, but you probably saw 20 bears and you saw them many different times, right? And I don't want to take away from that excitement of that number, because it is that many times that you saw those bears, but you probably saw the same one again. And it's just that hard to know if you saw that same one again, because they look really similar. So we didn't have proof of this adoption because of this individual identifying thing. But a few years ago in Brooks, we had a situation where one mama bear, we'll call her Jane, became distracted. And there was another bear going after her fish. Her cubs fled the scene. She is known for having many, many cubs. Some years she's had as many as 4 or 5 cubs. That's not sustainable in that area. And one of her cubs, unfortunately, got lost in this mix-up. And it was like, people saw this happen. It was really hard to see. You get very sort of drawn into the days of our lives in the bear world there. However, Holly, who is a sort of 399, we'll say, of the area, she saw the whole thing and she adopted that bear. And what's been most fascinating to see is not only did she successfully raise that bear, but you can see here the larger bear in the background is the bear that she adopted. And she had a cub of her own the next year, the smaller bear. She raised them together. Everyone thought that that larger bear would hurt, the adopted bear would hurt the new cub. No way, Holly wasn't going to put up with that. She's a good mom, right? She was like, oh, here's the rules, chicas. So she taught them how to behave. she also was seen, remember that area I told you about where the moms and cubs would be feeding?
The nursery, so to speak.
Exactly. We watched Holly, her adopted cub, and her new cub feeding in the same area as Jane and her now new cubs. Oprah would have loved it. She would have been like all over the interviews that day. Like, how does it feel to see your birth mom again? It was amazing to watch. And here's proof that adoption happens, that a bear mom can raise these two cubs of different years together. And she gave that adopted cub an additional year. So she kept that cub for longer. Phenomenal mom, and so cool to see what happens in the wild. I think it's a definite version of altruism. I know it's not a different species, but that's altruistic behavior. That's for sure. So
it brings us right back to what we kind of started this conversation with, and it is the behavior. But this is an atypical behavior, and this is something we don't see. And so, yeah, I understand why this is a story you tell time and time again. One of your favorite stories because of the difference in behavior, right? It's atypical. It's not something you typically see. And here it is happening and evolving right in front of your face.
Yep. It's a beautiful story. So those are our favorite things over the years, just a few of them. I think we could probably have a webinar a week for a year on our favorite things, because there's so many of them. We are so privileged to say that, at the end of the day, all of this animal behavior that we get to see, our favorite thing is to share it with you guys, to share it with our guests. Like, it is not fun to experience animal behavior in a vacuum. What's fun is to get to turn to the guests that we get to travel with and say, look at what's happening over here. Look at this ecosystem, and let's learn about it and talk about it and understand this incredible natural world that we're in. So my favorite thing at the end of this is to travel with our guests to these places.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we can talk in nauseam, whether it's the light or it's the behavior, the bison or a specific bear. Yesterday we focused on one single story about a single dog, but at the end of the day, and I wish I could see all of the listeners' faces here, because that is what makes it, right? When you can explain that the bison are going to start to protect their young because there's 2 black wolves on approach, and you can see the excitement and people start to follow along, and that it's justifying in what we do, and it kind of pulls on some heartstrings a little bit, to know that we're able to not only entrench ourselves into this knowledge and into these wild places, but to bring people with us and share what we know with them.
Absolutely. You're making me cry, Corbin. Absolutely. All right, so Kendall, with that, we will turn it over to questions.
All right, thank you, you guys. For everyone watching, if you have questions for Corbin or Annie, I just want to remind you, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, we've got a lot of questions about Bear 399, so we'll start with a few of those. How does a mother bear manage to care for 4 cubs?
This is the first time I have seen this, and I actually haven't seen her in person with her 4 cubs, but this is new for her as well. And Annie, correct me if I'm wrong with your experience with brown bears in Alaska, but really it comes down to a management of her resources. She's got to be very diligent and very careful about where she's sourcing food, and she's going to be paying attention to which of her cubs are doing better than the others. And she's probably going to make a call at some point on how to continue to feed those bears and how to address their different needs.
It also came down to previous resources, right? So
Sure.
In order for her to have created that many cubs, she had a lot of good fat on her to have that successful of a number of cubs. So that's part of it. And so for her to just sustain nursing them and getting enough food, that is her focus. And if she can get them, the 2 most sort of dangerous times for cubs is not actually right now when they're with her, it's right when they're born. So they made it through that time. And then their first year away from mom. That's the next most sort of dangerous time. So right now they're in good hands. Clearly, she's taking good care of them. And she has, it looks like with her daughter and whatnot, a great success rate of raising successful cubs. So I think there's a lot of hope in this story for these guys.
I believe she has 17 descendants.
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
That's amazing. So how does one identify 399? How do you know it's her?
Well, I mean, just seeing her time and time again, you do start to pick up on facial features mostly. Some other things you can look at is the size of the hump on her back. But that's actually a funny question. Funny that you mentioned that, because as we were going through these photos today, I was looking at photos from different articles, and I was comparing them to photos that Drew and Mike presented, and it is kind of hard to tell. And I even questioned some of my own photos that I knew was 399 because I was standing there taking them. And I was like, wait a second, that doesn't seem quite like it's her. But in this instance, one of the biggest things to identifying 399 is the location. She's a Pilgrim Creek bear. It's a kind of a micro ecosystem for her right on the border of the national forest and the national park and the Tetons. And that's been her area since she was born in 1996. So we do have the benefit of knowing her habits and her her locale, so to speak.
Okay. And going back to the story, Annie, that you talked about of the adopted cub, would the adopted cub be able to recognize the birth mother?
I would think yes. Bears are very knowledgeable regarding scent. And so I think that, we know that they have scent glands on the bottom of their paws, and every time that they put their paw down, they leave basically some information. They also leave information from the smell with their fur that they leave on trees and whatnot. So they communicate a whole world of information via scent. That in itself, I think, could be another whole bit of information. So I believe, yes, that cub knew, I don't think that cub knows concept like Happy Mother's Day the way, we do, but recognition of, yes, I believe that there is some familiarity there. But at the same time, she lost the cub. So it does bring up an interesting point. Like, for her to be able to, in this small area, have a split. There's a lot of bears around. There's a lot of smells. She tends to lose cubs. That's that, like, she's got a pattern of, getting distracted. So I would almost wonder more on the mom side than the cub side.
Right. Now, with multiple cubs, going back to 399, this probably pertains more to, will the mother keep the cubs a little bit longer if she has more cubs? And will she not go into estrus if her cubs are with her longer?
Do you want me to take that, Corbin?
Go ahead. You got the biology on this stuff. I'm the photo guy.
Yeah. So she will not go into estrus with bears is a not voluntary the same way that it is with, or involuntary the same way that it is with humans. So there's that piece. As far as keeping the cubs longer, probably not, unless there's some kind of stressor that happens, such as the example that we had with the adopted cub, that Holly decided to keep the adopted cub the same amount of time that she kept the new cub. So essentially, she stayed on the regular clock for the cub that she gave birth to. So normally I would say no, she won't keep those cubs longer. She'll she'll kind of stick to whatever the norm is in that region, and that can be a regional thing. So I'm not actually sure what the amount of time that females in that area typically keep their cubs for. I'm guessing that it's a year, year and a half, but it does change from area to area.
Yeah, I would say that frame is about right. Even in some cases, pushing towards 2 years. But I think with 4 cubs and being, shy on resources, or at least thin on trying to provide 4 cubs, I think that she's gonna not only follow that timeline, but potentially even try to get them out the door sooner.
And then she'll take a year off, or maybe 2, before she mates again. And what it is that she might mate, but it doesn't mean it will be a successful pregnancy.
Sure.
Okay, so we've got a couple Yellowstone questions before we end today's webinar. Someone wants to know if the bison spar with each other.
It is one of my favorite things to watch. When we start to approach the end of summer, even as early as late July, we enter the rut, we call it. And basically it's who, at least with the males, it's who's bigger and who's badder. Throughout the summer, we watch the females and the young, they congregate in herds, and the males are largely isolated and they kind of do their own thing. And it's interesting, at the beginning of the rut, we start to see the smaller males start to kind of poke and prod at the herds and try to find a potential mate. And we see, at least in my experience, I see the bigger males waiting a little bit. And I think that that's because they know that they're going to come in, push their weight around physically, and they're going to land a mate. They're confident in that. Younger males, I would say 3 years into a male bison's life is when they can actually start to compete for that. And yeah, it does get, it gets violent. I don't know if you recently saw, there was a video circulating of a bison just completely removing another bison off of a roadway in Yellowstone. So yeah, it happens and it's powerful.
All right. And to visit Yellowstone in the winter, must one be signed up with a guided group, or can you go on your own?
Depends on what you're wanting to do. If you're a cross-country skier and you just want to ski in for the day, you're more than welcome to do so. If you are a snowmobiler, that is on a lottery permit base. Otherwise, to enter the interior of Yellowstone, you do need to be on a guided trip. The only place in the winter in Yellowstone that you can enter in your private vehicle at your whimsy is the northern part, actually in Lamar Valley, where we see the wolves on our trips. So you can, in theory, rent a car or use your own car and go through. But I will say, having experienced some stories from people who didn't have a guide, it's probably worth getting one.
All right, great. Well, you two, this was wonderful. I know this is your last webinar of 2020. It's been quite a year, but I am so grateful and thankful to both of you for spending so much time with us this year. You've made it so much more tolerable and enjoyable than it otherwise would have been. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing comments.
All right. Well, thank you, Kendall, and thanks to all of you who continue to join us. I can't wait to see you in January. I'm going to be doing a talk January 7 on our new Alaska trip. So please join me for that. I am really looking forward to it. And I'll leave it for you to close us out today, Corbin.
Yeah, just same thing. I can't repeat it enough. It's always wonderful working with you, Annie and Kendall. Thanks again for all the work you do. And I know that putting these together is stressful. And yeah, happy holidays and happy new year. And Annie, hopefully we get to work with you again soon.
Sounds great. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys again. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature and our last Daily Dose of 2020. We do have more to come in 2021. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have a replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Happy New Year.
Bye.
Bye.